I have the fortune of being the WICAS conference chair, which means that I get to stand up here and act like I did something for this, when in fact, really, all of the serious organizing work was done by the staff for the Center for Asian Studies. And I want to just acknowledge now some of those people. I'm not sure if you're in the room or not, but Danielle Salaz, Julie Gittinger, and Kunga Lama all have played a very important role in making this come together, and we appreciate very much indeed their help. I also want to take this opportunity to acknowledge our program here, our outreach program, Teaching in East Asia, whose director, Lynn Parisi, is sitting back there. It's an extremely vibrant and exciting program for school teachers that is constantly engaging in various different outreach activities here through CU, and tomorrow we'll have a program at the conference. I also want to thank very much the President's Fund for the Humanities for its support for this conference, as well as, of course, the Center for Asian Studies, which has contributed a great deal of labor as well as financial support to enable this to take place. Right now, I'd like to introduce my friend and colleague, Janet Tice, who is the president of the WCAS and comes to us from the University of Utah, and who last year played host to this conference and persuaded me to bring it here.
Arm twisting, I think was the appropriate term there. Welcome. I'm delighted to be able to make a few welcoming remarks on behalf of the WICAS organization, which is quite a free-form organization, really. We're a voluntary group made up of people who are enthusiastic about getting together to talk about Asia in the Western region. And WICAS is, after going through a period where we had some trouble convincing folks that this was a fun project to work on, we have now entered a new and really exciting period in the development of the Western Conference. We had a very successful conference in Salt Lake City last year. The program for this Boulder conference looks absolutely fantastic. And we have some wonderful venues lined up for the future. University of Arizona next year, and Neil Pennington from the University of Arizona will be the point person, I believe, for the organization next year. And then following that will be in Los Angeles at Cal State Northridge. And we have some other plans for venues beyond that. The enthusiasm that people bring to WICAS as hosts is what keeps WICAS alive and really makes it a fun and exciting organization to be a part of. This organization depends on having schools that are willing to step up and do all the work of running the conference. The rewards can be enormous in terms of bringing local Asian studies successes onto the regional and even the national stage, showing off your wonderful Asia programs. And of course, what we strive for is to ensure that the quality of the WICAS experience is very high, that we get a nice mix of established scholars and a very healthy group of up-and-coming graduate students who can come and use this as an opportunity to network, an opportunity to get their feet wet with making often their first presentations, and testing out their research ideas for the first time in front of a group of people other than their own professors. So WICAS serves a great mentoring function for the next generation of students, as well as being a wonderful way for us to get together with our fellow Asian Studies colleagues and friends. So we thank you all for your enthusiastic support of this organization. We look forward to seeing you at future WICAS conferences, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Janet. And now it's my pleasure to introduce another friend and colleague, Professor Laurel Rod, who is the director of the Center for Asian Studies here on campus, a professor of Japanese who specializes in classical Japanese literature. Laurel?
Thank you. We are delighted to welcome the Western Conference of the Association for Asian Studies back to Boulder again. I think it's been over a decade since we were last able to play host, and on that occasion, as I recall, we had over 2 feet of snow on the weekend when we hosted the conference, so that half of the presenters were unable to arrive, and the ones who did arrive were unable to leave. So I'm very pleased. We have sunshine today, and the weather promises to be even better tomorrow. I'm also pleased that we do have this opportunity to bring you up to date on some developments in Asian studies at CU in the past decade or so. There have been a lot, and I know that our supportive administrators are going to share some of that information. So I'm just going to content myself now with 3 breaking news developments from the last few weeks. The highlight is the recent receipt of an extraordinary endowment of $1.2 million from a family foundation to be used to underwrite summer faculty-led courses in China. The first of these will take place in 2010, and we're looking forward to active participation of China faculty in this ongoing opportunity. I believe this is one of the largest gifts to the humanities ever at CU, and we're especially pleased that it's coming from an alum who wants to share, wants other students to share the opportunities that meant a great deal to her when she was at CU. Secondly, I noticed in a report that came from our Office of Grants and Contracts last week that the total of grant income to the Center for Asian Studies for 2008 so far has almost reached $2 million. So we're doing quite well in terms of our programmatic initiatives and the support that they're receiving from outside the university. And finally, in terms of academics, there have been several recent developments in Asian area graduate programs at CU. There are new graduate tracks in Chinese, Japanese, and South Asian history, which are already admitting students. And the newly renamed Department of Asian Languages and Civilizations, formerly East Asian Languages and Civilizations, has a proposal for new PhD tracks in Japanese and Chinese. They're moving through the approval process. We look forward to welcoming our first PhD students in Japanese and Chinese literary and cultural studies in a year or so. There are a number of flyers and brochures upstairs on the tables about other upcoming activities, and I encourage you to help yourselves to those. And now I'd like to introduce my boss, Graham Oddie, Professor of Philosophy and Associate Dean for the Arts and Humanities since 2002. It's Graham to whom the center reports, and he's been very helpful in facilitating the kind of interdisciplinary initiatives that the center is charged with developing. I appreciate his coming to offer a welcome today on behalf of the college, and hope that you'll have an opportunity to thank him for his support this evening. Graham.
Well, the pleasure's all mine to be able to come here this evening to welcome you all from very many different places around the world. I just cast my eye over the program, and I hope I don't miss any countries here, but there are people not only from the region and close by states, but far-flung states, and Japan, China, Canada, England, Taiwan. Welcome to all of you on behalf of the College of Arts and Sciences. It's a real pleasure for us to be able to host this conference here and to be able to share with you for a couple of days this really beautiful part of the world, and I hope you'll get a chance to see some of that. You're allowed out. You don't have to go to every session. You know. Sneak off from time to time and partake of some of the joys of this place. It's also been a real pleasure for me as Associate Dean with some sort of responsibility for this program. I say that because in a way this program is blessed with these tremendously energetic and talented people who've been just driving it forward for the last 5 years, and I've just been sort of sitting there and saying, yes, you can do that. Okay, yes, go get that money there, that'll be fine. And people like Laurel and Dennis and Tim and lots of other people, and Janice, who we've just appointed in the last couple of years to take over the new Asian program. So it's just been a real joy for me to work with these people and to be able, on occasions, to do a little bit to actually help them unleash all their energies. And we've just gone ahead in leaps and bounds with adding languages like Indonesian and Farsi and Hindi and Arabic and Hebrew, all within the broad rubric of this much expanded Pan-Asian movement here. So I want to thank you, Laurel, and all the other participants, Dennis and so on, who have played such an energetic and really commendable role in this. None of it would have happened without them. So thank you very much. Again, welcome to this conference. It's a fascinating menu of options you have before you. I don't know how you're going to choose between the sessions, but I'm sure you'll have some way of doing so. So welcome, have a great time, and hope you come back.
Last but not least, I'd like to introduce our Chancellor. Bud Peterson was appointed Chancellor of the University of Colorado at Boulder in July of 2006. Doesn't seem like it was that long ago. His academic specialty is mechanical engineering, and he's been a prolific contributor to research in that field, in addition to playing an active role in helping to establish the national education and research agendas, serving on numerous industry, government, and academic task forces and committees over the years. Since coming to CU, he is engaged in activities as diverse as leading the university in its planning for the future through the flagship 2030 initiative and dancing the Japanese Bonodori at the annual Asia Day, sponsored by the Center for Asian Studies. I know that Bud has had a long day since, although I'm guessing perhaps no longer than most, since he delivered the State of the University address early this morning, so I particularly appreciate his willingness to come this evening to welcome you on behalf of the university.
Thank you, Laurel. I feel a little bit like a fish out of water here, a mechanical engineer in front of these humanists and specialists, people with expertise in such a broad and eclectic range. I look at the program that you have, and I see topics ranging from Korean economics, Japanese literature, and the politics of protest in Tibet. And like Graham, wonder to some extent how it is that you'll choose between these wonderful topics. It's a pleasure for me to be able to welcome you here on behalf of the university. As Laurel mentioned, I this morning gave an event that happens once a year. The faculty, I think, are thankful for that, but it's a State of the University address that talks about the things that we've done in the past year and the things that we hope to accomplish in the coming year. The focus this morning was really on the strategic plan and how we move forward. We started the process about 2 years ago, shortly after I came, to identify the characteristics of a great public university in the year 2030. We wanted to reach out and think about what it would take to be a great university in the future, not what a great university is today, but what we needed to do to prepare for the future. And the reason I mention that to you is because we came up with a series of 8 what we called core initiatives and 10 transformational initiatives. Many of those initiatives are in fact addressed by the Center for Asian Studies, and as I was thinking about this and thinking about what to say, and then reflecting on some of the comments I made this morning, we talk about issues in the strategic plan of ensuring access, learning for a diverse world, making sure that we are preparing our students for a world in which their encounters with people from other cultures and other nations will most surely play a huge role in their future and their success. The ideas of global crossroads. We're here in Colorado, we're relatively landlocked, but this can be, the university can be a global crossroads, and we talk about bringing the world to CU and taking CU to the world. And when I think about that, the Center for Asian Studies that exists here in many ways embodies a large number of those attributes that we'd like for the entire university to reflect as we move forward. And so, Laurel, I commend you and the other folks that work in the center. We are expanding our efforts in this area. We recently added 3 new faculty positions, and with a little success on some grants, hope to add some more in the future, and are looking forward to that. The center, which was Laurel mentioned, was established about a decade ago, has already become an innovative leader in the way we educate students here at CU and the way we prepare them for their careers in the coming century. Its designation as a National Center for Regional Asian, or a National Resource Center for Asian Studies has enabled us to add new programs. Graham talked about some of the new languages, but new programs, new faculty, new facilities, new colloquia, and events like this. And in many ways are reaching out and either, I hope, inspiring the rest of the university to move forward from this global perspective, or perhaps in some cases dragging us along. The impact this brings to the university, that the center brings, and conferences like this bring to the university are really quite remarkable. We are a national comprehensive research university, and that comprehensive portion is the part that I think is most exciting about a university like this, that we're able to do things that bring people together, that cover areas of knowledge and expertise and scholarly endeavors that other universities may not be able to develop or encourage or bring a collective critical mass of people together that can inspire the type of scholarship that is necessary to move these endeavors forward. As Graham mentioned, I hope you get a chance to see a little bit of Boulder. This is a marvelous campus in the Italian Tuscany vernacular. It is 132 years old. We've had 8 architects in that 132-year period, which is one of the reasons I think that when you look at the university, it has a very similar feel and style to the architecture. And I hope you get a chance to see it. I hope you get a chance to visit the city of Boulder a little bit, and hope you find your experiences here both enlightening and stimulating. Thank you. Welcome to Boulder, and welcome to the University of Colorado.
Thank you very much again to both of you for coming and for being here to welcome our friends and guests. I wanted to add one response to what was just stated. Chancellor Peterson, when he arrived here 2 years ago, created an initiative that enabled new hiring, as he mentioned, in the area of Asian studies. Specifically, and there was a competition from various different quarters of the campus to get new lines. We were very fortunate that our proposal to hire people to do work in area of connection between the Islamic world and East Asia was funded. We've already made one hire through that initiative, and this year my department is running a search for a specialist in Chinese history whose focus looks to the Islamic world. So I appreciate that very much, and I'm very excited to be chair of that search. It's my pleasure now to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Robert Buswell, who is professor of Buddhist Studies, director of the Center for Buddhist Studies at the University of California at Los Angeles, and our new president for the Association for Asian Studies. Welcome. Professor Buswell's PhD comes from a very fine institution, the University of California, Berkeley, where many of us in this room received our training. In many respects, going to conferences like this is always a bit of a reunion experience and a very pleasurable one. Professor Buswell has a long list of publications. I had a outdated CV of his, and I thought it looked like it must have been outdated, given that I know he's very prolific, and the publication stopped a while back, so I asked him if this was in fact up to date. He said, no, it's very old, and I couldn't write fast enough all of the titles of the things that he has published since then. So let me just name a few of them. And I hope I've got this down correctly. The most recent book is Cultivating Original Enlightenment. He is the editor of the Encyclopedia of Buddhism. He is the author or the compiler of a source book, Religions of Korea in Practice, which is part of a very well-known series that comes out of Princeton. And the list of titles goes back and a long way, but he asked me just to name a few, and so I will honor that. We're very glad to have Professor Buswell with us for this conference, and the title of his address tonight is Korean Buddhism in the East Asian Context. Please join me in welcoming Professor Robert Buswell.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here with all of you in Boulder. This is my first time at the university, and it's absolutely gorgeous. I was just telling your chancellor and dean it must be very easy to recruit faculty into Boulder. We always have trouble in Los Angeles just getting people to consider the prospect of moving to the city. It must be nice to have that not be an issue here. It's also a special pleasure for me to be with you here at the Western Conference of the AAS, because this is actually my home conference. And I think it's something that I notice at many of us who come out of Western universities, perhaps because we're relatively young in the context of American academe, but also because we're just closer to Asia than all those other big institutions over on the East Coast. And I think we see here happening just as we see all across the West. Universities really taking Asia and making it mainstream in academia, not something which is peripheral to the study of social sciences or humanities, but really mainstream to those studies. And it's really interesting to see you here develop a larger Department of Asian Languages and Civilizations. You've got your Title VI Center, so clearly there's much going on. It's also, I think, quite telling that looking at all the regional conferences the AAS has around the country, and really around the world, in fact, this is by far the largest of all the regional conferences this year. I was amazed at the number of panels you've been able to put together this year. It's really quite an inspiration to all of us at making Asian studies around the country. For me, it's also a great honor to be able to give the keynote. And this is actually for a very personal reason. I work, as you may know, in Korean Buddhism. And for years, I felt like I was kind of out there in the wilderness all by myself. Whenever I would go to a conference on Korea, I was always the last person because there was nobody else on Buddhism, so they kind of put me at the end, and I would kind of have to be the last person to speak. If I went to a conference on Buddhism, I was the only one in Korea, so I'd be, again, last. You do India, you do China, you do Japan, we'll put Korea at the end. So finally, not only am I not last, but actually I get to go first for a change. So what I want to do today is to talk a little bit about a topic that is of great interest to me. And I hope that I can try to make it interesting to all of you as well, which is looking at Korea as something more than just a peninsular feature or a peninsular civilization, but something which actually has, I think, deep roots all throughout the East Asian region. I think especially in the case of Buddhism, I'll be able to make this case, and I hope you'll find it of interest. This is a study on Korean Buddhism in its broader East Asian and really, I think, broader Asian context. If we look at the story of Buddhism that tradition tells us, we have seemingly unremitting waves of missionaries breaking over the ever-expanding shores of the Asian continent in what, with little exaggeration, we may call the world's first example of globalization. Soon after the inception of Buddhism, around the 6th century BCE, we're told that the Buddha ordered his monks to, quote, wander forth for the welfare and weal of gods and men. This command initiated one of the greatest missionary movements in all of world religious history, a movement that over the next millennium would spread Buddhism from the shores of the Caspian Sea in the west to the Indonesian steppes in the north, the Japanese Isles in the east, and the Indonesian archipelago in the south. Buddhist missionaries, typically following long-established trade routes between the geographical and cultural regions of Asia, arrived in China by at least the beginning of the first millennium CE, and reached the rest of East Asia within another few hundred years. In the modern era, Buddhism has even begun to build a significant presence in the Americas and Europe. As I discovered coming to the conference today, we passed the Naropa Institute, a major Buddhist university here in the West. But this account of a monolithic missionary movement spreading steadily eastward across Asia is just one part of the story. The case of East Asian Buddhism suggests there's also a different tale to tell. A tale in which this dominant current of diffusion creates important eddies, or what I call countercurrents of influence that redound back toward the center. Because of the leading role played by the cultural and political center of China in most developments within East Asia, we inevitably assume that regional developments within Buddhism would have begun first on the mainland of Asia, and from there spread throughout the rest of the region where Buddhism also came to flourish, and where literary Chinese was the medium of learned communication. Through sheer size alone, of course, the monolith that was China would tend to dominate the creative work of East Asian Buddhism. But this dominance need not imply that innovations did not take place on the periphery of East Asia, innovations that could have a profound effect throughout the region, including on the Chinese heartland itself. These countercurrents of influence, as I call them, can have significant, even profound impact on neighboring traditions, affecting them in manifold ways. I'm increasingly convinced, in fact, that we should not neglect the place of these peripheral traditions of East Asia, those in Japan, in Vietnam, Tibet, perhaps, but certainly in the case of Korea, in any comprehensive accounting of the evolution of a broader Sinitic tradition of Buddhism. Korea was subject to many of the same forces that prompted the growth of Buddhism on the Chinese mainland, and Korean commentarial and scriptural writings, again, all composed in literary Chinese, were often able to exert as pervasive an influence throughout East Asia as were texts written in China proper. Given the organic nature I propose for the East Asian traditions of Buddhism, such peripheral creations could have found their way back to the Chinese center and have been accepted by the Chinese as readily as their own indigenous compositions. We have definitive evidence, for example, that such influence occurred with the writings of Korean Buddhist exegetes. In considering these filiations of influence between the traditions of East Asian Buddhism, then, we therefore must not look only from the center to the periphery, from China to the rest of East Asia, as is typically done, but also from the periphery toward the center. Looking at the patterns of influence that Korean Buddhism exerts in East Asia will also allow us to move beyond a traditional metaphor used in scholarship on Korea, in which the peninsula is viewed merely as a bridge for the transmission of Buddhism and Sinitic culture from the Chinese mainland to the islands of Japan. As enduring as this metaphor has been in the scholarship, it long ago became anachronistic, a Japan-centric view of Korea that should finally be discarded for good. In fact, as I will explore in this talk, most of the early transmission of Buddhism to Japan occurred along a current that led not from China, but directly from Korea. Much less well understood than even this Korean influence on early Japanese Buddhism is the impact of Buddhists from the peninsula on several schools of Buddhism in China itself. And finally, Korean Buddhism was able to exert substantial influence in regions far removed from the peninsula, even in areas as distant from Korea as Sichuan and Tibet. Korea was not a bridge. It was instead a bastion of Buddhist culture in East Asia in its own right, which could play a critical role in the evolution of the broader Sinitic Buddhist tradition. Notwithstanding another regrettable metaphor, that of the hermit kingdom, to talk about Korea, which early Western visitors gave to the peninsula, we should note also that throughout most of its history, Korea was in no way isolated from its neighbors throughout the region. Korea was woven inextricably into the web of Sinitic civilization since at least the inception of the Common Era. The infiltration of Chinese civilization into the Korean peninsula was accelerated through the missionary activities of the Buddhists, who brought not only their religious teachings and their rituals to Korea, but also the breadth and depth of Chinese cultural knowledge as a whole. To a great extent, it was Buddhism, with its large body of written scriptures, that helped to foster among the Koreans literacy in written Chinese, and ultimately familiarity with the full range of Chinese religious and secular writing, including Confucian philosophy, Bellet, calendrics, and divination. Korea played an integral role in the eastward transmission of Buddhism and culture into East Asia region as a whole. Buddhist monks, artisans, and craftsmen from the Korean Peninsula made major contributions to the development of Japanese civilization, including its Buddhist culture. The role of the early Korean kingdom of Baekje in transmitting Buddhist culture to the Japanese islands was one of the two most critical influences in the entire history of Japan, rivaled perhaps only by the 19th century encounter with Western culture. Indeed, for at least a century, from the middle of the 6th to the end of the 7th centuries, Baekje influence dominated cultural production in Japan and constituted one of the main currents of Buddhism's transmission to Japan. Korean Buddhist scholar monks brought the Confucian classics, Buddhist scriptures, and medical knowledge to Japan. Artisans introduced Sinitic monastic architecture, construction techniques, and even tailoring. The early 7th century Korean monk Kwan Luk, who is known to the Buddhist tradition as a specialist in the Madhyamaka school of Mahayana philosophy, also brought along documents on calendrics, on astronomy, geometry, divination, and numerology. Korean monks were instrumental in establishing the Buddhist ecclesiastical hierarchy in Japan and served in its first supervisory positions. And finally, the growth of an order of nuns in Japan occurred through Korean influence, thanks to Japanese nuns who traveled to Baekje to study, including 3 nuns who studied Vinaya in Baekje for 3 years during the late 6th century. But even after cultural transmission directly from the Chinese mainland to Japan began to dominate toward the end of the 7th century, an influential Korean countercurrent reappeared during the Kamakura era, during the 12th to 14th centuries, which affected the Pure Land movement of Honen and especially Shinran. So, at least through the 13th century then, Korea continued to exert important influences over the evolution of Japanese Buddhism. Despite the apparent geographical isolation from the major scholastic and practice centers of Buddhism in China, Korean adherents of Buddhism maintained close and continuous contacts with their brethren on the mainland through much of the pre-modern era. Korea's proximity to northern China via the overland route through Manchuria assured the establishment of close diplomatic and cultural ties between the peninsula and the mainland. In addition, during its 3 kingdoms and unified Chola period, so from the 4th till about the 10th centuries, Korea was the virtual Phoenicia of East Asia, and its nautical prowess and well-developed sea lanes made the peninsula's seaports the hubs of regional commerce. It was thus relatively easy for Korean monks to accompany trading parties to China, where they could train and study together with Chinese adepts. Indian, a Japanese pilgrim in China during the middle of the 9th century, remarks on the large Korean contingent among the foreign monks in the Tang Chinese capital of Chang'an. He also reports that all along Chinese eastern seacoast there were permanent communities of Koreans, which were granted extraterritorial privileges and had their own autonomous political administrations. Monasteries were established in those communities, which served as ethnic centers for the many Korean monks and traders operating in China, much as Protestant churches do today in the immigrant communities in Los Angeles, for example. Koreans even ventured beyond China to travel to the Buddhist homeland of India itself. Of the several Korean monks known to have gone on pilgrimage to India, the best known is He Cho, who flourished in the early to mid 8th century, who journeyed to India via sea and traveled all over the subcontinent before returning overland to China in 727. The ready interchange that occurred throughout the East Asian region in all areas of culture allowed indigenous Korean contributions to Buddhist thought, again, all composed in literary Chinese, to become known in China and eventually even beyond in Central Asia and Tibet. Writings produced in China and Korea especially were transmitted elsewhere with relative dispatch within about usually 1 generation, so that scholars throughout East Asia were kept well apprised of advances made by their colleagues. Thus, doctrinal treatises and scriptural commentaries written in Chola Korea by such monks as Visan, Wonhyo, and Kyunghoon were much admired in both China and Japan, and their insights influenced, for example, the thought of Fazan, the systematizer of the Chinese Huayan school. So this ready interchange between Korea China and Japan, and with other neighboring traditions as well, has led me to refer to what I call an East Asian tradition of Buddhism, which is something more than just the sum of its constituent national parts. Korean Buddhist pilgrims were also frequent visitors to the mainland of China, where they were active participants in the Chinese tradition itself. Although many of these pilgrims eventually returned back to Korea, we have substantial evidence of several who remained behind in China for varying lengths of time and who became prominent leaders in Chinese Buddhist schools. I think we just a couple of examples to show the range and breadth of the Korean influence in China proper. One of the best known examples is that of the Shilla monk Wan Chuk, Yuanzi in Chinese or Tibetan Wen Tseg, who lived during the 7th century. He contributed immense amounts to the development of the Chinese Faxiang or Yogacara school. Wan Chuk was one of the two main disciples of the preeminent Chinese pilgrim translator Xuanzang, who died in the 7th century, and his relics, the relics of Wan Chuk are still enshrined today, right next to those of Xuanzang himself, in a reliquary in the ancient Chinese capital of Xi'an. Still today, Wan Chuk remains perhaps best known in Tibet, in fact, rather than even in Korea, because of his renowned commentary to the Sandi Rinpoche Sutra, which the Tibetans know as the Great Chinese Commentary, was very influential in the development of Tibetan Buddhism. Wan Chuk's commentary, this Great Chinese Commentary so-called, was extremely popular in the Chinese outpost of Dunhuan, where Chusgram Fa Cheng translated it into Tibetan at the command of King Raopachang in the 9th century. 5 centuries later, the Tibetan scholar Tsongkhapa drew heavily on Wan Chuk's work in articulating his crucial reforms of the Tibetan doctrinal tradition. Wan Chuk's views were decisive in Tibetan formulations of such issues as the hermeneutical stratagem of the 3 turnings of the wheel of the law of the Dharma Chakra, the 9 types of consciousness or vijnana, and the quality and nature of the 9th immaculate consciousness, the Amula Vijnana. Exegetical techniques used in this Great Chinese Commentary of this Korean monk, Wan Chuk, were subsequently used in all major sects of Tibetan Buddhism, with their elaborate use of sections and subsections, and this is thought even probably to derive from this translation made in the 9th century of Wan Chuk's commentary. Later during the Song Dynasty, Cheguan or Diguan revived a moribund Chinese Tiantai school and wrote the definitive treatise on its doctrinal taxonomy, the Tiantai Sujiangyi, an outline of the 4-fold teachings according to the Tiantai school. This is widely regarded as one of the classics of Chinese Buddhism, but written again by a Korean. Several other Korean monks were intimately involved as well with the Tiantai school up through the Song Dynasty, including Wi Chan, the courtier prince, the Buddhist monk, and bibliophile. In fact, there was a temple in the one of the capitals of China, which was called the Great Korea Monastery, because Wi Chan's funerary portrait was enshrined there, so that the Korea dynasty would continue to pay tribute to the Song in order to maintain this temple essentially as a merit cloister for this courtier prince Wi Chan, who stayed in China and lived in China for many years. These contacts between Chinese and Korean Buddhism are especially pronounced in the case of the Chan and Sun traditions of Sinitic Buddhism. 2 of the earliest schools of Chan Buddhism in China were the Jingzhong and the Baotang school, both of which were centered in what was then the wild frontier of Sichuan, the 4 Rivers region in the southwest. Both of these schools claimed as their patriarch a Chan master of Korean heritage, named in Chinese Wuxian, or the Korean Musan. And he's better known, in fact, to the Chan tradition as Reverend Kim Hwasan, using his native Korean surname. Musan reduced all the Chan teachings to the 3 phrases of not remembering, which equated with morality, not thinking with samadhi or concentration, and not forgetting with wisdom or prajna. And even after his demise, Musan's teachings continued to be closely studied by such influential scholiasts in the Chan tradition as Zongmi. The pervasive use of literary Chinese in the names of these Korean expatriate monks and of other expatriate monks as well in China sometimes masked for us today the fact that the men behind these names were often not Chinese at all, but were monks from the periphery of East Asia. Many of the expatriate Koreans who were influential in China became thoroughly Sinicized, but rarely without retaining some sense of dedication with their native tradition, such as through continued correspondence with colleagues on the Korean Peninsula. In the case of Wisang, for example, this very important early monk in the development of the Chinese Huayan or Huaom school, we're told that despite assuming control of the Chinese Huayan school after his master Zhiyan's death, he eventually heard that there was an impending invasion of Korea by the Tang, and returned then to Korea in order to warn Showa about this upcoming invasion. The invasion forestalled, Wisang was rewarded with munificent royal support, and his Huaom school dominated Korean Buddhist scholasticism from that point on. And in fact, Fa Zeng, who's often known as the most important figure in the Chinese Huayan school, he himself was in fact a Parthian, not a Chinese either. But Wisang, as his successor, he used to write to Wisang in Korea for guidance long after Wisang had returned back to the Korean Peninsula. We still have today this correspondence extant. So why would monks from Korea have been able to exert such wide-ranging influence, both geographically and temporally, across the East Asian Buddhist tradition? I believe it's because Buddhist monks saw themselves not so much as Korean or Japanese or Chinese monks, but instead as joint collaborators in a religious tradition that transcended contemporary notions of nation and of time. These monks' conceptions of themselves were much broader than the shrunken imaginings of recent history, to paraphrase Benedict Anderson's well-known statement about modern nationalism. Korean Buddhists of the pre-modern age would probably have been more apt to consider themselves members of an ordination line, or of a monastic lineage, as members of a school of thought or a tradition of practice, than as Korean Buddhists. If they were to refer to themselves at all, it was not as Korean Buddhists, but as disciples, or as teachers, proselytes, doctrinal specialists, or meditators, all terms that are suggested in the categorizations of monks, down to the various Gaosunzhong, the biographies of eminent monks, which date from as early as the 5th century. These categorizations transcended national and cultural boundaries. There are, for example, no sections in these biographies for Korean monks or Japanese monks, and so forth. And the Chinese compilation of these biographies of eminent monks would subsume into their main listings biographies of Koreans, Indians, Khitans, Inter-Asians, and Japanese. Hence, although the biographies might mention that Buddhists were a monk of Shilla or a sage of Hedong, both designations that are attested in the biographies, they are usually categorized actually as proselytists or as doctrinal specialists, meditators, and so forth. And these people then may simultaneously be disciples of X, or teachers of Y, or meditators with Z. But unlike many of the other peoples who lived on the periphery of the Sinaitic cultural sphere, Koreans also worked throughout the pre-modern period to maintain a cultural, social, and political identity that was distinct from China. Koreans throughout their history remained active participants in Sinaitic civilization while also seeking to maintain always their cultural self-sufficiency. Let me give you just a couple of examples to illustrate this sense of simultaneous participation in East Asian culture while also maintaining an independent identity for Korea. During the Goryeo period, for example, in the 4th of Wangun, the founder of the Goryeo dynasties, 10 injunctions to his descendants on how they could ensure the continued success of this new dynasty. He reminds his subjects that Korea is distinct from China, and that it must continue to maintain its own independent cultural and social traditions. In the past, he says, we have always had a deep attachment for the ways of China, and all of our institutions have been modeled upon those of Tang. But our country occupies a different geographical location, and our people's character is different from that of the Chinese. So there's no reason for us to strain ourselves unreasonably to copy the Chinese way, he says. In his entreaty to support Buddhism, Wangun also hints that there are uniquely Korean versions of important rituals that should be maintained. This nascent sense of a distinctive Korean practice of Buddhism is discussed in the 6th injunction of Wangun, where he notes, I deem the two festivals, the lamp-lighting festival and the Pudwan, or Prohibitions festival, to be of great spiritual value and importance. At some future time, villainous courtiers may propose the abandonment or modification of these festivals. No change should be allowed. This Pudwan ritual, for example, is well known in both China and in India, in fact, where it was a Buddhist fortnightly ritual in which laypersons would take the 8 precepts, essentially making them novice monks for a day. But the Korean interpretation of this ritual as a naturalistic rite seems to be otherwise unknown in Asia and may be uniquely Korean innovations. So simultaneous with their recognition of their clan and local identity, with their allegiance to a particular state and monarch, their connection to Buddhist monastic and ordination lineages and so forth, Buddhist monks of the pre-modern age also viewed themselves as participating in the universal transmission of the Dharma, going back spatially and temporally to India and to the person of the Buddha himself. With such a vision in place, East Asian Buddhists could continue to be active participants in a religious tradition whose origins were distant both geographically and temporally. East Asians of the pre-modern age viewed Buddhism as a universal religion that was pristine and pure in its thought, in its practice, and in its realization. Hence there was the need for hermeneutical taxonomies to explain how the plethora of competing Buddhist texts and doctrines, each claiming to be pristinely Buddhist, but also seemingly at times to be almost diametrically opposed to one another, were actually part of a coherent heuristic plan within religion, as if all of Buddhism's many variations were in fact cut from whole cloth. This vision of their tradition also accounts for the persistent attempt of all the indigenous schools of East Asian Buddhism to trace their origins back through an unbroken lineage of ancestors or patriarchs back to the person of the Buddha himself. But once we begin tracing these countercurrents of influence in East Asian Buddhism, however, I think we discover that the lineages of these patriarchs often lead us back not to China or to Japan, but instead to Korea. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to meeting all of you.